In this chapter, we're going to talk about the Stonewall structure. And, well, it has a flat out, I would say, dubious reputation. While the previous structures we have been talking about generally are considered balanced. Stonewall, one will think that it's quite weakening. And the Stonewall, in its pure form, was normally sort of played via the Dutch with one f5 or perhaps one e6 followed by f5. This is like what the sort of former world champion Botvinnik would do, even in world championship matches. But generally, the pure original Stonewall is considered dubious these days. But the Stonewall structure quite often comes via transposition. It can come from the Slav, from the Queen's Indian, from the Catalan, and we will see several instances of that. And it's, well, it's typical that when circumstances become moderately favorable for black, there will be a switch to the Stonewall structure. And this is kind of its modern interpretation. And that perhaps also makes it a little bit difficult to sort of discuss it here in general, because if white is allowed to play freely, then things goes quite well. I mean, the obvious problem is that there is this huge weakness of the e5 square. And I mean, well, it would be easy, for instance, to put the bishop on c just on f4, but typically that's not really possible. White has either played the move e3 blocking the bishop, or have played g3 when then the bishop on f4 can be chased back with f5, for instance. How the white pieces will naturally flow also very much depends on how we have reached the structure. I mean, will the bishop be on sort of, well, the bishop be developed in this diagonal or in this diagonal? Again, very much depends on the specifics. Like, let's say that the Dutch typically goes d4, f5, g3, and then we will have a bishop going to g2. But in many Slavs, the Stonewall happens after having played e3. So it's more difficult to sort of make a flow sort of chart, but like we did in previous chapters here, because it is not too easy, well, to sort of predict which kind of structure it will be, because it very much is the reversed order, that we will only get the Stonewall after the pieces has been defined. If you look at it from black's perspective, is there actually something pleasant to say for black? Yes, I think there is. I mean, even you see quite some strong players. Magnus Carlsen, for instance, started playing the Stonewall very successfully. It's the pleasant thing is one thing, that it keeps a lot of pieces on the board. You have the chance to outplay your opponent. But if we talk about only the structure, I would argue that it's one of the few black structures where, if anyone, it's black who has a space advantage, right? I mean, there is, if we talk about pure space control, black is doing just as well as white. I mean, there's no real chance of playing e4. The square we have very well protected, and well, we will typically see white play c4 and then black will play c6. But it only sort of equals central influence, right? There's a pawn on c4, but there's also one on f5 as well. A bonus of having this, let's say, space on the center/king side is that your king is going to be very safe on g8. In other lines, there will always be some kind of attacking game where, you know, white crashes through. It's just normal when you're white, you get to attack. But actually, in the Stonewall structure, your king is very typically extremely safe, and this comes by having this kind of extra space. Well, of course, the problem is that you have a weak square at e5, but sometimes if that's your only problem, you can basically navigate around it. And maybe the black pieces are more defined than white. So white can, you know, go in different directions. But for black, I would argue that the knight goes to f6, typically to d7, the bishop very often to d6. We're going to castle short. The queen is going to go to e7. And maybe this bad bishop on c8, well, it has to figure out how is it not going to be bad eternally. And the classical way was d7, e8, and then, you know, somewhere to h5. This was perhaps how Botvinnik would do it. But also a more modern way is just to take your bishop here and put it on b7. That works quite well. So a generally rich structure, but also one with a somewhat dubious reputation. I don't think it is as dubious as some might think, But also, I think when we go through the chapter, we will see that things tend to be rather nice for white. So it's maybe a typical opening like people like Carlsen would play, because you have a good chance to outplay your opponent. But, well, it is, I think there is a reason behind its dubious structure, that white is typically somewhat better. Anyway, let's have a look. We are starting off the Stonewall structure chapter, but really, I would almost say like a disclaimer, sort of that the author makes sure that, well, okay, I told you this can be a risky structure, and now let me give you an image that you will remember forever of how bad the Stonewall can structurally be. I mean, basically, this is I would almost say completely overdone example, because it's so horrible from Black's perspective. Well, problem number one, white has a beautiful knight on e5, and Black has this Stonewall structure that, well, by default leaves this hole on e5. But of course, normally Black would try to counter this square, but by, for instance, maybe keeping the dark squared bishops, or alternatively ensuring that the knight would be able to sort of exchange this knight on e5. But here the knight is, well, it basically takes 4 moves to challenge the knight on e5, and the dark squared bishops are gone. So this knight on e5 is going to be there forever. But this is not the end of Black's misery. Also, sometimes in the Stonewall, a bishop on b7 will be very strong. But here it's just a horrible piece, right? It's blocked by basically every pawn possible, and yeah, it's not going to do anything useful there. It's only standing there and defending the pawn from c6 for not dropping immediately. Perhaps some minor details, but also the pawn has gone to g4. That's a little bit too far in terms of, well, you will never be able to use the pawn to, for instance, push f4, but perhaps even worse, white will have moves like f3 and h3 starting to undermine it. So, as I said, basically, this is an example of how bad things can be if you actually combines all Black's problem into one position. White is not just better here, white is completely strategically winning. In the game, white plays a4, and this is a good move because it exploits that also, I would argue, this structure on the queen side is sort of passive, and well, not passive, but it's sort of inviting white to open the a file, which would give easy access to actually the critical parts of Black's position, and as we will see, it soon collapses. The author makes the point that would, in this position, the Black pawn be on a5 and a rook on a8, it would be much harder for white to break through. That is a good general comment, but in this position, not so much. I mean, it's important to understand that also white is strategically winning on the king side. I think a move like f3 would actually be quite clever, basically trying to open files here. I mean, well, if we would get to, let's say, take on g4, Black has to take back, and this pawn becomes quite weaker. And we could even start maybe, playing moves in the f file like rook f1. The logical move would be h5 to sort of be able to recapture like this. But then there is a very nice plan for white to play the move king to f2. And basically we want to play h3 next. And yeah, this is just very, very bad. We want to play h3 and want to have the rook on h1 being the point. And also, well, the idea is that after, let's say, rook c8, h3, we are actually using the king to cover the g3 pawn, which else, well, would be weak because there was a queen attack on it. This position is just strategically hopeless for Black. Maybe you could be a little bit deceived that there is some activity in the f line, but let's just say f4. We're just going to take the pawn. If it takes, the king is absolutely safe here because there is nothing, for Black to attack it. I mean, these pieces are completely out of play. I'm not saying a4 is not a great move in this position. a4 is excellent. I'm just making the point that white is so winning that he only needs one flank to break through. It can be the queen side, it can be the king side in this position because Black's position is so bad. I just wanted to add that it's not depending on being able to break through on the queen side, although as we will see, that works brilliantly. So black is insinuating counterplay with f4, not that it's dangerous, but white stops it. And I think the game goes h5. The author debates a little bit if something like this could be a possibility, but it seems to be way too slow. And even should queen takes a2 happen, it's not like king f1 is a big deal. There's no way for white to for black to break through, and the white queen, as we will see, penetrate will be on the queen side, will be much more dangerous. But of course, one could also start defending a typical way. I mean, if one was really scared, a way to defend is something like this, and after queen h5, we have either h3 or h4 with the idea if they take, we will just swap the queens and the black attack is gone and white is winning on the queen side. So it's really a position where black has no reasonable counterplay. He tries putting the h pawn forward, but it doesn't possess any danger. Now, Mareko plays this move queen a5, which is cool and fancy. It's basically trying to penetrate with the queen. White's position is so good that basically everything works. The simplistic way would be just to take on b5, and when they take back with the a pawn, we're gonna go rook a1. And we're gonna put a rook to a7, and basically we're gonna harass like this, and black's structure will start to crumble. We're gonna double in the a file, maybe triple with the queen going to a5, and it's strategically bust for black. But queen a5 is a funny move, and I think mainly Mareko is having a bit of fun. h4, he goes queen b6. Knight a8, queen a7. It's very beautiful having the queen there, and it's also very useful. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. The game goes takes, queen c7, and after takes, he goes rook a1, rook to h6, and now, I mean, I'm sure you could start winning with moves like perhaps rook a6 or something like this, maybe sacrifice an exchange and break down the structure, but it's not particularly necessary. So Mareko changes his plans a bit, and finally puts the rook on a7 like this, and it's just completely game over. I mean, these two pieces are out of play, and while we can make a point that this bishop on g2 is moderately weak, it's uncomparable to these ones. The game goes rook f6. If white just wanted to win trivially, knight takes c6 is great, but Mareko plays the move e4. It introduces threats like a check on g5, for instance, so it's completely hopeless. The game was like this, and after takes queen f4, black chose to resign. Everything is gonna drop. I mean, there is no counter threats. You can choose to play, let's say, rook e1, rook e3, and have threats like this you could undermine with f3, but also you're most likely gonna win material depending on how black is doing this. So okay, the final stages here I think is too horrible for black's perspective to focus on. I think I think it's actually a great example, even if it's overdoes how bad black's position can be. I think it's reasonable to understand that here we are actually playing with strategic danger. Quite often it works well for black, and that is important to understand. But to have this understanding of that, sure, it can work well, but it should be understood that it is a considerable weakness, giving away the e5 square, and it's good to have an example of actually how bad this can be. And I think it's useful to understand that there is a breakthrough on this side, but there is also a potential breakthrough on the other side. And one should, I mean, when one sees this position, it's important to say white is completely strategically winning. It's not a matter of white being a little bit better or somewhat better. No, this is a disaster, and one should be able to grasp that. Anyway, don't worry, if you're a Stonewall fan, we will see situations where it works well, but we are starting off on an ultimate low. Let's talk about how to refute the Stonewall from an opening perspective. This is a game between Jon Ludvig Hammer and Rune Djurhus, and well, it's from the Norwegian League in 2013. Well, Jon Ludvig Hammer I mentioned a little bit before. Now he's mainly doing commentary, but he was a very strong chess player when he was active, and he's still quite young and a very sort of serious student of the game. And we see him here employing a setup against the Stonewall that, like, well, 11 years ago, it was almost like considered not a refutation, but not that far off. And I remember it being very popular in sort of Scandinavian circles. It's the concept of playing the knight to c3 and the queen to c2. I mean, normally it would sort of, white would play moves that are more connected with, let's say, the e5 square. It could be maybe knight to d2, or to be playing b3 and bishop b2, or hinting at bishop a3. This looks like more natural development moves, but the concept is that white very often wants to go rook b1 and b4. And this was kind of a newest plan at that point that did incredibly well. And basically, well, many of us at some point didn't like playing against the Stonewall, but we got extremely fascinated by this and basically got the feeling that, wow, this is the refutation of the Stonewall. So let's look a little bit at it. Well, first of all, of course, it's possible to be very greedy and grab a pawn, but, well, to be honest, that happens very rarely. And for instance, it happens rarely because it's not great from black's perspective. Simply the white compensation is overwhelming, and something like e4 is just good for white. Well, also, I mean, the concept of the Stonewall is to have this incredibly solid structure. And if you start taking on c4, you remove the d5 pawn, which really is a cornerstone of this structure, to be exact. So what are kind of reasonable moves? I would guess something like queen e7 could be seen as quite decent, but then at the time, bishop g5 was thought quite good. It provokes h6, and then probably we're going to exchange on f6, actually. And if you go knight to d7, we can take on d5. And normally you want to take back like this, but then the f5 pawn would be hanging, right? So there is queen e7 is not as easy as it seems. The game goes knight e4, which is by far the most common move. But, well, I think the reason that sort of white slowed down and thought, okay, maybe this is a decent system, but nothing more, is more positional plans by black. And we saw recently in a online blitz game where Kramnik played the move a5. And maybe this is the best version of a common plan, that after a3, then bishop d7. And the concept is that actually black wants to push this move b5. Maybe it feels weird that, well, is black really allowed to attack on the queen side? But it's not really attacking. It's more trying to keep the structure closed. And let's say, well, if white takes, then actually blacks get quite some space. Maybe the knight can even go to the attractive square c6, certainly. And should white close the situation, I don't know, probably we're going to go to c7. And then we have gained some space like this. And this concept of pushing for b5 meant not at all that the white system was not dangerous, but more that this concept of talking about refutation was too strong. But that took some years for black to grasp. In the beginning, they would more play a move like rook e1, and then comes this nice move, rook to b1. It basically just wants to push b4 and want to get the queen side sort of space grab or positional attack, if you want, going more or less immediately. There is a small tactic that sort of makes it possible. After the move queen to e7, white can play b4 anyway, because if bishop takes b4, then knight takes e4, f takes e4, and then move bishop to g5. And now, well, you can't protect the bishop on c5. Well, you can go queen d6, but then we play c5, and then it's gone. And basically, well, of course, black will be able to take on f3, but it's going to end up materially equal, but with white having the pair of bishops and open files and basically everything in a sort of positional way going well for white's perspective. So this doesn't really work. You can't basically stop the b4 advance like this. Black would try various things. For instance, knight d7 perhaps is decent, the book mentions. The concept is, again, after b4, you go b5. And, well, here you exploit the sort of the concept that, well, it's possible to take and do like this. And somehow, well, you get control of the queenside structure. Here even, let's say, knight b6 to c4 becomes tempting. It looks like perhaps queen c6 wins because of the double attack. But actually the move queen b6 is quite strong. And after queen takes a8, you don't necessarily have to go, let's say, bishop b7, and although even such is quite interesting, but in some positions a queen can actually be just as strong as two rooks. But there is even the possibility of bishop b8, and you can go bishop b7 next, which is quite interesting. So this idea of playing for b5 is extremely relevant, but as I mentioned, it took a while before black managed to discover this strategic concept. So Djurhuus is playing a5, Hammer goes a3, and again, if you go queen e7, we can play b4 because there is the same tactic. So the game went knight to d7, b4, and then an exchange, then a further exchange, and then the move b5. Well, I assume it sounds weird that I said it took a while before black discovered the b5 concept, because that's exactly what he does here. But the circumstances here are quite bad. So I think, well, what I should rephrase it was, it took a while before black managed to figure out exactly how to play b5. Just to understand that, well, why is it b5 is so important for black? Well, if you do something like knight f6, you could either start playing b5 immediately, or you could even play c5, bishop c7, and maybe knight e5 followed by b5 is what the book suggests. And basically, this becomes a pretty sad story for black. Maybe also moves like bishop f4, rook a1, etc. and such would happen. So black goes b5 in this position. And the game continues bishop g5, which is quite logical. I do find it interesting that the book doesn't mention the move c5. And, well, I would also think c5, no, that's not really what you want. You don't want to close the position. But actually here it's almost strategically devastating, the computer points out. The general idea is just, okay, let's say the bishop goes to c7. I mean, maybe we would flick in bishop g5 first, but in general, rook a1, and the a file is extremely important. We saw it in the previous game. And, well, the same is the case here, that, well, black will not really be able to sort of make sure that white doesn't get control of the a file. And then basically there will be something on a7 that's just going to create tremendous influence. It's not necessarily winning material immediately, but it's going to be extremely annoying having something standing somewhat undisturbed on a7 and just threatening along the 7th rank. And, well, maybe black, you know, could put a bishop on b8 defending it, but then we're going to put a bishop on f4 trying to exchange that. And it's a huge strategical gain. So I think this move c5 here is actually noteworthy because it basically goes against this narrative that we will see in the game, that white shouldn't close the position, he should try and open the c file. And that's also how I generally saw it. But the computer says, no, this is an instance where c5 is actually strategically crushing, exactly because of the huge potential in the a file. Also, when you look at this position, you will say, well, black has the a file, not white. But the problem is white can just take it over. There is not, I mean, black is not having sufficient resources to basically take control of it. But what Hammer does, there's nothing particularly wrong with. He plays bishop g5. The book mentions that now it would be a lesser evil to play something like knight to f6, and that's probably correct, but still, after, let's say, takes, knight e5, bishop d7, rook a1, it's a pretty sad story for black. Well, it's a stronger knight. You can't really do something like queen b6 because we will take an f6 and then d7 is going to be hanging. And while in in some more close Stonewall structures, one could at times feel that black has some kind of long-term perspective. Here, he's really just reduced to trying to defend and not lose immediately, or not to be much worse. So I think it's quite easy to understand that this became a very popular option for white. And well, Joes didn't make it better for him. He played bishop e7, an exchange like this, and it's not like c5 is bad here. I mean, c5, something like knight f6, we're gonna go rook a1, but at least black, keeps some kind of solidity. Well, the book says knight e5, huge advantage, which is true, but I would assume something like rook c8, rook c8, bishop to e8, and black actually stays very compact and solid. So that's why the way we understood things is that very often the correct move was to take on d5 or b5 would lead to the same position. And after takes, we will start using the c file. Hammer goes to c7. The book mentions that queen c6 is perhaps even a little bit better. It creates the tactical threat of taking the rook. And after rook b8, rook fc1, well, somehow it gets perhaps even more uncomfortable than the game. But to be honest, it's quite similar. So queen c7 happened, and the computer is, and the book as well, mentions that now after queen d8, rook fc1, knight b6, somehow black hangs in there. As usual, moves like rook a1 exist, and white is going to be better. Well, not in this exact position, it blunders a rook, but well, you will play knight e5, you will exchange queens, you will go rook a1, and there's no doubt white is better, but black is just defending quite well. The game was like this instead, and after knight e5, basically it's a strategic disaster. I think game was queen d8, rook f to c1, and after this exchange, basically it's extremely hard for black. Now the difference is after knight b6, e3, knight c4, white can just take it. If you take with the b pawn, then basically white's b pawn becomes unstoppable, and if you take with the d pawn, then bishop c6 is just going to collect this weakness here. So the game was knight e5, d5. Rook d8, e3. I think we can maybe stop here. It's just an obviously great position, right? This black bishop is confined to defending weaknesses. White has a rook on c1, and well, there was some inaccuracies here and there, but basically it's borderlining white having a winning position. There is a threat of rook b7 collecting this pawn. I think it's quite understandable that games like this and the concept in general got so popular, right? Instead of sort of having to play slow ideas of trying to exchange bishops and being slightly better, it felt like, we do like this, we go rook b1, we go b4, and we just open the queen side, and things goes well for us. But as you saw also, black started defending quite well. So at that point, well, this sort of classical Stonewall move order from the actual Dutch was not doing too badly for black. And even Magnus Carlsen at some point decided, why don't I play the Stonewall? And he won nice games, both against Caruana and against Anand with the black pieces. But this renaissance was really overturned by modern computers and neural networks. And nowadays, barely anyone plays the pure Stonewall. So let's just discuss the details. So let's say d4, e6, c4, f5, g3, knight f6. Well, this is kind of the typical Stonewall move order if you come from the Dutch. And now, well, our game went bishop g2, but believe it or not, this is inaccurate by my modern standards. White should play the move knight to f3. And it basically commits black to, well, either playing d5 immediately or putting the bishop on e7. The sort of modern Stonewall for black has always been to put the bishop on d6. And I think Well, maybe let me explain why the bishop should be on d6. The point is that after a move like b3, intending to play bishop a3 with a favorable exchange, black has to move queen e7. This is sort of a very basic point of why we want to have the bishop on d6. So after the move knight f3, well, of course you can play the move bishop e7, but then you don't get the setup you want. So the idea of black is to play the move d5. And now the modern computer says the move knight c3 is incredibly annoying. It feels a little bit weird. For instance, well, why knight c3 now? Why didn't we, let's say, play knight c3 in this position? But if you go knight c3 here, black can start putting his bishop on b4. And then he will not play d5 and a Stonewall, but more a Nimzo-Indian concept. So basically, white is supposed to postpone that. So g3, knight f6, knight f3 is a clever move order. Now, I mean, the logical move for black is to play d5 because we don't, well, bishop b4 check, we can go either knight d2 or bishop d2, and if you put the bishop on e7, is awkwardly played. But d5, knight c3 poses interesting strategical problems. The main idea is that, let's say, after bishop to d6, white wants to go bishop f4. This is quite a typical idea of allowing bishop takes f4, but now you are doing it without the bishop on g2, which is quite favorable with the circumstances. So let's say something like castle e3, queen e7. White's position is generally promising, says the computer, but its preference is actually playing h4, let's say 60s h5, and either you have to allow to push the pawn to h6, which is strategically quite dangerous, but also should you play h6 yourself, then suddenly there is a knight jumping in this direction. Maybe it would be reasonable to add that something like, I think the concept is something like this, and the computer says white already has a considerable advantage. Maybe you would think that such a pawn is not that great, but due to Alpha Zero, I think we have started to understand that there is some great long-term attacking chances like that. Okay, that was a slight detour, but bishop f4 is a strong move here, partly because the bishop is not on g2 first, and this seemed to be quite strong. So after knight c3, black could also choose to play the move c6, and then hope that, well, after bishop g2, he will play bishop d6. But white should then play the move bishop f4, getting ready to exchange on d6. Then logically, we could play the move bishop e7, and we would argue, well, this bishop is quite weirdly placed here. It is, and that is how we understood it, when we didn't have a strong AI to help us, that, nah, this is too awkward for white. But the computer just says, no problem whatsoever. It wants to play e3, and after castling, well, happily just h4, and it's, let's say, a sample line, knight e4, queen c2, knight d7. And here, I mean, in my youth, I had similar things, but then I would try to castle long, and it wouldn't necessarily go so well. The computer just says bishop e2, knight df6, castles, no problems whatsoever. It's just having a Stonewall with the bishop on e2 and the bishop on f4. And, well, the point is the bishop on f4 is actually very well placed, and white would push things on the queen's side. And from a sort of human perspective, we would think, isn't this kind of considerable weaknesses? But the computer says no. It quite sort of controls g5, and it doesn't really matter, and white is considerably better in this position. So I thought this is a very interesting modern twist, and I think this is the reason at top level that no one sort of is playing the pure Stonewall like this anymore. We are the Dutch. This is how Botvinnik would do it. I mean, well, after f5, maybe you don't like to face knight c3 or bishop g5, so if you're happy to play the French, you would play e6 first, it doesn't really matter. But then, after moves like this, they will start setting up the Stonewall more or less immediately. But this seems to have fallen out of fashion. But like with other structures, just because they don't arise via its sort of original name, the Stonewall, we are the Dutch, is not particularly a problem. We will see that from several openings, Catalan, Queen's Indian, well, actually quite some openings, maybe even the Slav, we would quite often get Stonewall structures. So it depends debating the structure, despite that the way sort of it would normally arise has fallen under a cloud. So let's look at some examples of the Stonewall happening from different openings in the coming examples. Here we have another example of a Stonewall, and we can already see that one major difference is that there is a bishop on d3 rather than on g2, where it typically is in the sort of more pure Stonewall. But this is because here the opening moves has been first, black played, let's say, the Slav moves, and then only a little bit later the move f5. And this is a very, very typical scenario and position we have here. White's last move is bishop to b2. And, it doesn't feature in the game, but I think it's worth debating it, and so does the book, that after castling, sometimes you would play the move queen to c1, intending to play bishop a3, and basically getting rid of the dark squared bishops, which has the effect of weakening the defense of the sort of the square of e5, and that's generally favorable for white. A typical way to counter it to play the move b6 here, but let's say after bishop a3, it's not that simple for black. It could look like, well, can't we just play c5 and this bishop is going to be awkward here. Now, the book for some reason gives the wrong move order by mistake. What white should do is to take on d5 here. And somehow this is an unpleasant position for black. I think most often black will actually take with the knight here. And, then he will get a backward pawn on c5, but somehow the bishop will be out of play. If you take with the pawn like this, then knight c3 is kind of threatening knight b5 immediately, and it's supposed to be a bad structure for black. So this is kind of unpleasant. I mean, of course, if you're Magnus Carlsen, you just play bishop b7 after take takes, queen a3, takes. He actually won with the black pieces against Vidit here, but sort of common sense, and the computer says white is quite better due to the weaknesses of the dark squares. But, well, Carlsen is Carlsen, and he can apparently do whatever he feels like, right? I think the book mentions something like this, but I think there is some game between Delchev and Tregubov, but, well, you take with the knight, but something will appear on c4, and we get control of the e5 square, and white is better. So maybe this sort of concept of bishop a3 sounds a bit depressive from black's perspective, but then you could try and finesse it with black, and in this position you would see many who place the move b6 before castling. And this is very much an antidote against this queen c1 plan, because, well, when things sort of goes naturally like this, we can put the king on e7 and basically have the king in the center, which is, well, it's, very useful compared to having the king castled when it becomes an ending. It doesn't mean black is better or necessarily fully fine, but this finesse seemed to be quite important and somehow made the queen c1 plan disappear a little bit. And, Svitan actually gets the chance to do it after castling, but he chooses just to play knight c3, which is also very interesting. After knight e4, he falls back with the knight like this. And, well, the idea is that potentially he wants to challenge the knight on e4 with f3. But, of course, there's a knight on f3 first. So after knight d7, the game goes knight to e5. I mean, now black takes on e5, and this is a typical way of fighting the weakness of the e5 square, right? Because, well, now, of course, white has a pawn on the e5 square. But what you really want to exploit a weakness like this is to have a piece there. So it's a typical thing for black to exchange on e5 in order to, I don't know if you can argue that the weakness of the square disappears, but it does to some extent, right? Because this structure, the main weakness is some piece can stand there. The pawn stands there is much less of a problem. As we mentioned, the idea is to at some point play with f3, and that of course could give one the idea that maybe now black should play the move bishop c5. But white would just go bishop d4 and play f3 anyway. And this exchange of dark squared bishops is not unfavorable at all for white. So Doric plays bishop to c7. Game goes rook c1. I don't think the individual move matters too much here. Basically, the knight gets pushed back. Now I think black tries bishop b6 and sort of invite some complications. If you take an e4, then e3 and c1 is going to hang. Switzerland doesn't buy this, so he goes knight d4, knight to g5, queen c2. Black could consider a move like c5 now, but probably the white idea was this interesting piece sacrifice like this, and we have two incredibly strong central pawns for a piece. But I think sort of dwelling on details is not too important here. It more becomes an interesting structural debate. Game goes a5, c5 pushing the bishop back, bishop to c7, knight to e2, b5, a3 sealing the queen side. I think this position, however, is important to talk something about. I think the book points out that black's next move is well, he says almost like strategical blunder. It looks very, very natural what black is doing. Plays knight f7 and forces, well, now there is an attack on this pawn, right? So basically, white has to play f4 and close the position. Why is this so important? Or why is it, what is it black has done very wrong? I mean, obviously, we cannot prevent f4. Well, of course, white can play f4 at will, but having the knight on g5 means that as soon as white plays f4, I mean, let's make, I don't know, books suggest this. Should white then choose to play f4? Well, then we can jump to this square and generate considerable counterplay because we have a strong knight on e4. So, of course, I mean, you could argue it's a little bit sad that we just have to hang around with our knight on g5. But it's kind of crucial that basically whenever white does the desirable pawn push f4, it's important we can jump there immediately. And I think to appreciate this sort of detail, it's important to understand how unpleasant this position is with sort of the knight being on f7 or well, black tries to activate it, but it doesn't really work. Now, I mean, this knight becomes another passive piece compared with sort of like these ones, and basically nothing in the black's position sort of has any kind of positive thing to say, while having a knight on e4 at least would it would be annoying. White would still be better, but it would create some kind of counterplay, and also it would be out of the way in terms of that here it just ends up blocking black's play. He tries knight h6, knight d4, rook ab8, and now white plays the move h3, basically ensuring that this knight, there's no reasonable sort of circuit where it can become any kind of active. So black switches to passive defense and does this generally nice maneuver of getting the king out of the way. In my sort of previous Chessable course called Techniques of Positional Play, we debate this idea of evacuating a king like this and generally praises it. And it's useful here, but just white's position is very pleasant anyway. So Switan makes, a little bit back and forth. I think dwelling on, details makes little sense. I think I will just point out a couple of key things. Okay, the queen side gets blocked, which means, of course, the king is very solid on b7. Bishop c3, however, is important to notice because this is kind of a key move in terms of that the bishop now is gonna go towards h4. And, we see that this bishop would perhaps like to go to h5, but that's impossible due to the pawn being on g6. So white having this extra space has the effect that the bishop would end up on a favorable square. So, we see it here. Bishop goes to e1. Now it's going to go to h4 next. It leads to an exchange, which is favorable for white. And now he takes on f5. It's not necessarily necessary to do it immediately, but it is quite useful. Black exchanges the knight, and white takes with the bishop. Should you take with the pawn, then basically the idea is that you will play queen f2, and after something like this, you will start going h4. And either you will open with h5, or alternatively, if black sees it like this, my guess would be that you will hide your king somewhere here, you will put a rook on g5, you will double, and at some point you will sacrifice an exchange, or maybe you will push e6 and there will be tactics on f5. Basically, it's going to be extremely hard for black to keep everything defended. So Dorich choose to take with the g-pawn, and I think perhaps the next stage is something like, I guess here. White's next move is going to be queen h6. Should you prevent it like this, we could have like a change of guards like this, and then now our h-pawn is starting to march forward, and we would be able to open the position anyway. So game was like this, and now queen to h6, and basically there is an unstoppable threat of opening the g-file like that. Black takes off the queens, but oh sorry, my apologies. After this h4, basically, yeah. The bishop is removed, and it's more or less a nice mechanical win. I guess the threat now is rook g7, and we could even consider putting our king here. So the game is h6, and the final stage is a check here, forcing a rook f7, or alternatively we will play rook h7 next, so rook f7, rook g6, and basically we are going to win one of these pawns and game over. I'm sorry if I rushed over this stage too quickly, but it's just such a long game that if we sort of focus on every detail, it's going to be too long. But well, you have it in the sort of the actual course where you can play through at your own speed if you want. I thought it's a great example in general. I think this knight f7 mistake is very, very useful and interesting, and it's important to, I think, to grasp how bad and passive this situation is due to sort of the too many weak pieces, and somehow white can build up and do things very nicely. Switan did it in a brilliant way, and then okay, we sort of spoke a little bit in the opening about the concept of queen c1 and the idea of keeping the king on e8, so that, you know, if it becomes an ending, at least black will be compensated like that. So again, a few various sort of themes, and another example of white doing very well in the Stonewall. But I promise you, black will have a comeback in the next couple of games, so stay tuned for that. In this game, it's really comeback time for the Stonewall, but when we look at this position, there's no Stonewall, so what's the actual point? Well, this is something we see very often, that these games are not going to start out like Stonewalls at all. This is basically, I would argue, a kind of Queen's Indian structure, right? We have a bishop on b7, and a sort of, I would say, a typical Queen's Indian structure like that, with sensible development by black. But sometimes black will choose to go into a Stonewall structure, and this is exactly what happens here. Cordova plays the move rook to d1. That's probably a step in the wrong direction. It would be, well, better just to develop normally with knight to c3. But probably his idea is that after knight to e4, which is Naumkin's logical move, he's playing the move knight to e1, and he wants to expel this knight from the e4 square and only then follow up with knight to c3. It's actually, I mean, when I describe it like this, I think, this actually is very, very logical. But it's also seriously flawed. And Naumkin, the now sadly deceased strong Italian player, punishes it beautifully. He plays the move f5. So here, okay, now we have our Stonewall right, but we have chosen to play the Stonewall under quite favorable circumstances, because this knight on e1 is quite misplaced, and perhaps also the rook on d1 has sort of left the king side. But why does these things matter? Well, after the move a3 as in the game, Naumkin does it really brilliantly. he exposes that it does actually matter that these pieces has left the defense of the king's side, because he's not going to retreat. He's going to keep his pride there and just play the brilliant move bishop to d6. I mean, the author of the book says this is his favorite move of the game, and for sure it's an excellent sacrifice. And well, I mean, well, we have seen many sacrifices sort of through chess history with a bishop pointing on h2. So what's so special about this one? Well, the point is, after takes bishop to c2, black is basically winning strategically, but not in a sort of direct sense with a sacrifice, but just by a positional perspective. Now he plays the move queen to g5, and I think it's a very impressive evaluation that this position is just great for black. It feels a little bit hard to believe, right? Is the attack really worth a piece? What are we gonna do next? And for instance, I mean, white could even play the move bishop to a3 and remove this strong attacking piece, right? Because sacrificing on h2 seems to be too early now. But black can just take on f3, a3, and when takes back, the move knight f6. And the white position is so discoordinated. I think, well, these pieces are basically stumbling over each other. They all need the c2 square in order to sort of regroup, and there's no reasonable way to defend. I mean, black's threat is he's just going to play knight g4. Perhaps he will, well, take on e3 or in wait on f2, but maybe also just start doubling in the f file. And the computer says this position is basically just gone for black, for white, despite being a piece up. I think this is that's really fascinating to me. I would normally think, yeah, this could be good compensation, but also this bishop, on b7 is not really playing. Is this enough firepower? Yes, it's completely crushing, and that is quite interesting. I would say. The game, he chose to play knight to d2, and now can just develop with knight f6. And here, well, the absolutely only move to fight is the move that Cordova plays in the game. He plays knight to f3, just giving back the piece, trying to, survive a little bit further. It's even worth noting that it's important which knight you take, because after this move, queen h5 is strong, and there's even the threat of bishop takes h2 check now. So, I mean, I think it makes sense to dwell on this position. But of course, when we know it's great, we can perhaps start appreciating that knight g4 is just such a horrible threat attacking these two pawns. And, well, should you play something like h3? Well, then this square becomes a problem. And we're going to jump here, and basically knight g3 is going to be a disaster. So, no, when you know it, it starts to make sense to me. But the ability to judge it so well, one has to really credit Namkin for doing that. Okay, after knight f3, I guess the game loses somewhat its relevance for us, because it's not really a Stonewall anymore. It's just a game of chess that has went well from black's perspective. I think game was like this, and maybe now he didn't take back, because in this position, knight g4, h3, rook takes f3 apparently is completely crushing. The queen cannot take on f3 because there's a bishop here, and yeah, I think if you take on g4, it's going to be mate on h2. And if you take on f3, then knight h2 is a funny move, but which basically undermines f3, and things are going to collapse. So in the game after dc4, Cordova played e4, but Namkin just has an extra pawn and won a great game here. Okay, I think this is these details we should not care too much about in the end. We should just appreciate what a great game it was Namkin played. What did we learn? I think we learned that Stonewall structures, they come from, they appear quite from different structures. And, as we see here, white somehow thinks knight c3, then after knight e4, maybe he will get sort of an exchange that will make his position a little bit easier. And that is perhaps correct and a correct thought. But one should understand that Stonewall structures can appear very sort of quickly, and one should really judge, is that sort of sensible or not from black's perspective. And here, somehow it becomes, I mean, maybe even getting f5 next would be a good version, but after knight e1, f5, it becomes a great version. And while in the previous examples, perhaps we have seen Stonewall being more of a defense and looking, passive but solid from black's perspective, well, we saw here that when white has suddenly started making, clumsy moves, the black attack springs to life. So, Stonewall should more, I think, in modern times be seen as something that black can resort to when circumstances is right, more than as defense by its own merits. And I think this is how it is done nowadays. And I think this example is a brilliant one of this potential that the Stonewall can unleash if just the circumstances are somewhat favorable from his perspective. But a great game by Naunkin. This is a game from the World Cup in Tromsø in 2013, and it's Aronian with the white pieces against Tomaszewski. Aronian generally is quite a favorite player of ours, right? Because he's creative and does interesting things, and that's always useful to study. But in this game, it actually goes considerably wrong for him, and that's just life. When you live on the edge, at some points it will go wrong. Tomaszewski is a very strong Russian grandmaster, perhaps not the most well-known, but that's sort of the premise. If you come from perhaps the strongest chess country, which Russia has been really for a long time, then you can end up in the shadows, despite actually being an incredibly strong chess player. This position we have seen before in an earlier game in this chapter, and there white was doing bishop b2 and followed by knight c3, and we discussed bishop b2 followed by queen c1 to play bishop a3 and get rid of these bishops. But Aronian plays the move knight to e5 instead. It's not at all a bad move, and it preempts that should you play knight e4, we can just play f3 and remove the knight. And well, this is standard plan, but we saw earlier that if you do it with knight on e1, this bishop could become very strong attacking, right? So knight e5 with the idea of playing f3 actually has a considerable amount of logic to it. Tomaszewski answers with common sense. He castles, and after bishop d2, he plays the move bishop to d7. This is perhaps the classical Stonewall plan, where basically you admit that this bishop is a bad bishop, but you try to circle it out like this, or not circle, zigzag it out like this. While perhaps the more modern way of doing it is putting the bishop on b7 after having played b6. Like this, you keep your pawn structure intact, and you don't go b6 and weaken it, but you actually keep this structure like this. The problem perhaps is that it's somewhat slow, and of course using free moves to get the bishop to h5 is a bit much. Knight c3, bishop e8 happens. Now probably the next reaction from Aronian is not great. He should probably, I guess, do it like Schwitan and play the move knight e2 would be quite sensible. And, the bishop could go to h5, but we're just going to play f3, and perhaps later we can start attacking the bishop, and maybe it's not doing that well on h5 after all, I would argue. An interesting move could be to go queen to c2. Well, what happened in the game is that after c takes d5, black takes back with the pawn. This is quite reasonable now, because now the knight can go to c6 next. So the logical question in this position would be, perhaps we could postpone taking on d5 until black has committed this move knight d7, right? Queen c2 would be logical, but there is a major problem with that after knight to d7 takes on d5, we don't take back with the c-pawn. We can take with the e-pawn. The point is that suddenly we have counterplay against e5, and there's no reasonable way to exploit that. If we don't take the pawn on f5, it just ends up with a brilliant Carlsbad structure. So perhaps the logical way would be like this, but should you take the pawn, then after takes here, knight e4, and let's say queen h3, rook f6, black already has a massive attack with serious compensation. The computer's starting to like black here. So queen c2 has logic, but then black can actually change into a Carlsbad structure. So cd5, and now it's kind of different. If you take on d5, we're going to take on f5, and well, you can take on e5, you lose sort of the pair of bishop, and this bishop disappears. So that's not really what you want. But c takes d5 is actually quite typical, especially with the knight on b8, because it can go to c6. But also, while, I mean, well, of course, Carlsbad structure can look attractive, but still, this Stonewall structure like this is actually still very, very solid, despite the c-pawns being exchanged. Aronian just plays common sense, but now Tomaszewski gets his knight to c6. And then comes the move knight to b5. Perhaps this was Aronian's point, that now, of course, bishop b8 fails to bishop a3 with sort of tactical problems like this. But bishop b4 is an instructive and quite nice move. Maybe it looks weird that this bishop is now gonna sort of go around like this, but it's basically, well, of course it's losing time, but it only loses time in terms of that, well, white gets to play a3 and b4, which, to be honest, is not very useful moves. And here, somehow, the exchange of the c4 and c6 pawn means that the space disadvantage or that black had has kind of disappeared. And here, it's very difficult to come up with a useful plan for white. Aronian went bishop e2, a6, knight c3, and now knight to e4 to sort of seek exchanges. And, well, I think black is just completely fine here. And the problem perhaps is that Aronian is not willing to admit that immediately. He plays b4, bishop to c7, and now probably the sensible way was to play f4, basically a double Stonewall, if you want, sort of, I mean, well, this structure against this structure. Obviously, this is very blocked and can lead to exchanges and a draw. But Aronian was not ready to do that yet, but ends up in huge trouble. After bishop c7, he takes on e4, takes back, and goes queen to b3. But now comes a very, very nice move. I guess Aronian is sort of ready for scenarios like this, where he hopes that the c-file would create some kind of, counterplay, because black's bishop here is a little bit unstable. But bishop takes e5 is a great move. Generally, we don't like giving up the pair of bishops, but sometimes we do, and this is very much an example where it's great, because, well, if we compare to before, I mentioned this loose bishop on c7. Well, that's not great. On the other hand, this knight on c6 is brilliant. It attacks the weak pawn, but also it's very, very stable on c6. It blocks the c line in a much more efficient way. And I would argue that pawns on a6 and b7 are useful in terms of the b7 pawn stabilizes the knight by defending it, and the a6 pawn makes sure that white cannot easily play b4 and evict the knight. So this is kind of great. And this gives black the little amount of time he needs to reorganize quite an attack. First of all comes queen g5. It starts insinuating knight takes e5 perhaps, but that would allow some counterplay. But much more importantly, what happens now is after king h1, well, black has a good move. Well, white should have played queen d1 to stop it, but he didn't. And then bishop h5 is a great typical move of the Stonewall that basically, well, we have our bad piece, we have zigzagged here to sort of exchange it. It's, of course, a long maneuver, but Stonewall is a rather slow opening at times, and then you can afford making maneuvers like this if they have some considerable strategic benefit, which exchanging a bad bishop for a good bishop certainly is. Black is already much, much better here. Of course, white can argue, well, I have a strong bishop on b2, but it's only shooting into your own pawn, right? While this knight on c6 actually is a much stronger piece, because it's stable there, it blocks the c line, and it combines being useful with something aggressive, while this bishop on b2 actually just stares into its own pawn. It only has defensive purposes at the moment. And more sort of perhaps relevantly, there is an immediate threat to the bishop on e2. Aronian chose to play f3. That's ugly, but it's probably an admitting that things was not good. Let's say if you play queen d1, we're just gonna swap and go rook f7, and we have extremely straightforward play, right? Rook f8 next, and also at some point this weakness is gonna be a problem. You could also argue that you could take an h5, then maybe you could hope of some kind of activity on the queen side, but actually I think, well, black has a serious attack, maybe something like rook f5 next, or even worse, should you play h3, then the book points out that rook f3 is actually very strong, because you're starting to sacrifice there, and if you take here, then basically this is made in two. This was perhaps a little bit helpful from Wright's perspective, but I mean, Aronian played f3, and now I think queen h6 was a kind of nice way of doing it, and black somehow lacks. White lacks a good move in this position. The game was rook ce1, and then takes rook f7. Basically, the rook is coming next here, and it's a very difficult position. Game was bishop c1. Now bishop g6 was played, but that's mainly because Tomaszewski missed that he could play knight e5, and after e4 there is this nice little tactic: bishop f3, queen h3, and basically you're gonna win material back on f3 with a winning position. There is a pin like this. Okay, the latter stage perhaps became somewhat blurry, but I still think it was a great example chosen by the author. If we go back to sort of key positions, I would argue that already here it's an interesting addition to our arsenal. We have more seen perhaps the modern concept with the bishop on b7, right? But this zigzag keeps black structure extremely sound, and has this idea of basically arguing that, well, our only problem is this weak bishop, but if we get it to h5, it's not that weak anymore. Then I would argue that we saw also suddenly the Stonewall. If white misses a tactic and thinks that he can win a pawn on f5, then it can turn into this brilliant Carlsbad structure with, we are just threatening knight e4 with an attack, and even when he takes a pawn, we're going to get this Carlsbad attack in a very great version. And of course, perhaps especially, the c takes d5 concept is important, that, suddenly a knight will appear on c6, and that, we saw that this weakness on the e5 square, when the knight comes to c6, it can very often lead to an exchange there that even ended up in a strategical favorable version for black. So I hope that this game gave you sort of a good perspective of black's chances in, I would argue, somewhat atypical Stonewall structures. I mean, we see it here with a bishop on d3 rather than on g2, right? In an earlier game, we saw how white can have great chances, but this one was a good example to counter that with black succeeding, I think. Our final game in the Stonewall chapter is Harika Dronavalli against Michael Adams. Adams has always stood out to me as like an expert in the Stonewall, and that sounds weird because Adams never plays the Stonewall in the pure Stonewall form, but he's gotten it by a lot of transpositions, typically from the Queen's Indian or the Catalan. I remember when I was Anand second, Adams almost beat him with black in the Stonewall structure via Queen's Indian, and later I tried myself to sort of play this kind of structure with Adams in the World Cup, and I got absolutely nowhere there. Actually, the game I had with Adams is starting from this exact position that's also in the Dronavalli game. So I thought, let me just show you this first to have a sort of personal touch. I played the move b3. Dronavalli played bishop f4, which perhaps is the better move, but b3 was quite popular at the time of my game with Adams, which was 2011. He played bishop a6, and I played the move a4. It's basically, I'm trying to prove that this bishop on a6 is a little bit misplaced. It's typically very well placed there, but I want to play a5, and then somehow, the rook should create some kind of unpleasantness for him there. But it didn't work out too well. Here he played knight e4, bishop to e1, and f5. And now, well, we have gotten our Stonewall structure, right? And I mean, before I sort of started to look at this game with modern engines, I really thought that Adams was doing extremely well. That was apparently the narrative I believed, but well, modern computers seem to somewhat disagree. I thought it's extremely logical that he switches to a Stonewall now because my bishop on e1 is passive, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Also, maybe you can make the argument that it's not that bad on e1. There's actually no particularly good square for this bishop and the Stonewall, I would argue. Maybe sometimes on f4, but it can be kicked by g5. So it's a little bit out of the way, and it helps with sort of getting a5 ready, which is what I played. So Adams went bishop to d6, and here it seems that I somehow misunderstood the position, or perhaps rather was a little bit nervous. I played the move e3, which I would argue is a lazy move because, well, I mean, probably I was afraid of him playing f4, but it's not particularly an attack. I mean, it attacks the g3 pawn, but it's very sort of solidly covered. Even I have a bishop on e1. And I would rather say that should black play f4, then the problem is that the knight on e4 becomes much looser. I mean, the Stonewall structure is very, very solid, but as soon as you start moving it, it starts actually crumpling considerably. So black's threat very rarely is to play f4. Of course, he will do it when he's extremely good, but that's certainly not the case here. So I should have played the move knight c3 instead. And had Adams continued like in the game, queen e7, rook a2 is actually quite strong. Then you can see the doubling of rook comes, and this bishop actually starts to feel quite uncomfortable on the a6 square. I don't know how he should particularly react here. Maybe you could make arguments for bishop to b7, but even moves like a6 starts to be very annoying. So this would actually be quite good for white. I try a similar thing in the game, but I'm wasting too much time here by playing e3 first. Now Adams goes queen e7, and the computer is not a huge fan of that. It says that here he misses a chance, that he could play the move b5. This is generally not considered a very good idea, because after c5, this bishop on a6 can end up being completely shut out of the game. But the computer seems to massively disagree here and says that after bishop c7, knight c3, we can see that, well, white's idea is to put the knight on b4 when this bishop is going to be in a major crisis. But I would, at first sight, think, no, white is doing quite fine here. But the computer says not at all. It says g5. And, well, what is the point of having pawns like this? Well, it's something like, well, you can do it, so why not do it? You're grabbing space. It's not like I want to play neither f4 nor g4 immediately, but I'm grabbing a considerable amount of space. Maybe my queen will go to f6 and the rook to e8. And, well, there is some future on the king side, maybe even h5. I don't know, but also I think that I don't know is okay, because it's kind of flexible. The main problem is for white, there's absolutely no reasonable plan. I mean, I spoke about, let's say, knight a2, but for instance, you can just go bishop b7. After knight b4, you're in time to play a6. And while, sure, I have an ugly bishop here, but the queen side is completely sealed off, and I will go queen f6. I will probably put the rook on e8, maybe even e7 and g7, and then I can start pushing something like, in the position like that, I can start pushing, I was saying like this, and then I can start pushing h5, and it's actually a quite pleasant position. So that would have been good for Adams, but he didn't do that. He played the move queen to e7. And again, the computer just tells me that I just got this wrong. I played knight c3, which of course is a logical move, but the move bishop f1 would have been very strong. Generally, Well, why would I take my strong bishop on g2 and put it on an f1? Of course, there is tactics in this direction. But I think also, just on a general level, in the Stonewall, the bishop is not particularly well placed on g2. I mean, the whole point of this sort of blocking structure is actually to make the bishop on g2 blocked. I mean, it's facing the actual Stonewall, right? That's the kind of idea. But after bishop f1, suddenly Black is feeling some kind of heat. I think well, let's just say if he develops like this, I have this nice little trick that I can take and play c5, and we can see the bishop on f1 attacks the rook, and well, something's going to drop on d6, and white will be ahead in material and much better here. So after bishop f1, what to do? Well, bishop b7, I think something like a6 is annoying. I mean, of course, the queen side has somewhat closed, but let's say after takes like this knight, I mean, probably via c3 will go to b5, and the a7 pawn is going to be pretty weak. There will also, I mean, always be a question, is queen c6 a good move? Probably here there is rook b8, but even so, I think that the right direction is a knight jump to b5, which is going to be quite unpleasant. Also here, you don't have to play a6 immediately. Maybe you can play a move like knight c3, and you will start insinuating a6. And if this rook goes away to, let's say, c8, something like, let's say, like this, then, well, there will always be ideas like this, which is quite uncomfortable. So, I mean, after bishop f1 is actually not that easy. The logical move could be b5 again, but now there is a funny tactic. So take on d5, takes, and then the move queen c6. This bishop on a6 is actually lost. It's simply trapped. It's an unusual motive, but it's just trapped in a basically middle game with all the pieces on the board. It can't go to c8, right? Because then the rook on a8 would be hanging. There is a funny tactic though. Knight to b8, and after queen takes a8, there is queen c7. Now the queen is trapped, but white's luck is that you can't play bishop b7 because then the pawn on a7 is hanging. So after knight d2, black has to go knight to c6. So, well, at least I get two rooks. Quite often, actually, the queen against two rook is not too bad, but it always depends heavily on specifics. And in this position, the specifics are very good for white. White should take on e4 and then sacrifice a pawn like this. And when black takes it, rook c1, this bishop on a6 is very, very unfortunate. It's basically pinned like this, and you can't really move the bishop because then b5 would be hanging. But also you can't move the bishop, you can't move the pawn because then the bishop on a6 would be hanging. So here, white has a major edge. So I really should have played the move bishop to f1, but unfortunately I didn't. I played the move knight c3, and after knight f6, rook a2, I think the game went takes c5, and in this position I basically tried to, get out of sort of my discomfort zone and swapped on a8 and offered a draw, which Adams accepted. Quite interesting. Even when looking at the computer, I noticed that c takes d5, it's praising a lot. Sadly, on the day of recording, the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman has just died, and he wrote a very famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow that I think was very popular among chess players because, well, it described certain thought process and such. And one of the things that at least was very relevant for me was that, if you are thinking about typical problems, your brain can actually last for quite a long time. But if it becomes atypical problems, you will tire very quickly. And he gave some very good examples on that. Well, the book is about a lot of other things, but it's a Nobel Prize winner. I'm not capable of neither understanding it nor explaining it. But this part was relevant for me, that I suddenly felt that, well, why is it that I get so tired during a chess game? Well, that's typically because things feels unfamiliar. And for instance, in this position, after c takes d5, I can sort of almost feel my energy sapping away because it's very difficult. I mean, you can take with the pawn, but what does this mean to the structure? Or if you take with the knight, what's happening here? Well, the computer apparently says it's queen a1, and then you start putting pressure in the a file. And, well, Bishop goes back to b7, I would guess, but white is considerably better here. But that's very, very difficult for me. Maybe I'm going to start thinking of it. Something like d takes c5 is good, and if you take with the bishop, there is a6. But I think, well, what I sort of liked with the book was I got the feeling of that, well, intuition really matters a lot. Things has to feel familiar for us to be able to, well, concentrate during a whole chess game, to be able to play quite well. And I mean, well, that's also heavily the point of this this chessable course and this book, right? That we need to build intuition about structures. And well, it's going to be difficult enough when we have this intuition to sort of deal with the concrete things of the structure. But if we feel completely at lost, as I sometimes do in this Stonewall, then it becomes way too difficult. Anyway, this was a very long digression for actually the purpose of talking about the Dronavali-Adams games. But well, I hope it was a relevant sort of detour at least. Anyway, Harika, she played the move bishop f4. Harika is a world elite female player. It's well, she had several games with my wife. They used to be competitors, and sort of. But she's facing Michael Adams, who is a world elite player, and maybe like 100 to 200 points higher rated. So, well, I think Adams is trying to make the game complicated to play for a long time win, and manages to do that quite successfully. Anyway, bishop b7 happens, knight c3, knight h5, and well, white doesn't want sort of to allow black to take here, so she plays the move bishop to c1. It would not be unreasonable if you thought, okay, the bishop was on d2, then it goes to f4, and now to c1. Isn't c1 a worse square than d2? But actually not. And I think, let's say, if this knight goes back to f6, white will play the move b3. It starts insinuating that the bishop can go to the b2 square. Before, when it was on d2, then it was actually more awkwardly placed. And even perhaps more important is also that after rook c8, white is going to play e4. And then there's going to be some opposition in the d file. Let's say takes, and now I think c5 doesn't work so well because of tactics in the d file. Maybe I think the correct move could be something like knight takes f6, and let's see, if you do like this, there is a tactic in this direction as well. Anyway, that was not really the sort of purpose here, but it well, it just explains why this bishop has ended up on c1. Is actually in this Catalan and Stonewall structures, d2 is basically considered an awkward square. Anyway, f5, b3 happens. Extremely typical. And, well, why wouldn't Harika put her bishop on the b2 square? It's extremely logical. I was very puzzled that the book mentioned the move c takes d5, c takes d5, bishop to d2. But when I switched on my engine, it actually says, no, this is a very interesting strategy for white. Never seen it before, so kudos to sort of our author here for bringing it up. His argument is that, let's say rook c8, rook a c1, and he goes b5, queen b3, a6, and thinks this is a kind of equalish position. But actually here the computer suggests something very interesting. It says e3 is just better for white. The idea is to some extent to put the knight to e2 and to f4, but maybe not to f4 when it can be exchanged. But let's say knight f6, knight e2, and now I think it starts to dawn that what white really wants is to exchange this bishop. And if the dark squared bishop just disappears, well, then let's say maybe a knight will end up on the sort of, this knight will come to d3, then actually these squares starts becoming quite weak. I mean, this exchange is generally favorable for white, obviously. It looked like a move like rook c4 would just stop it, but then the computer says a3, and bishop b4 is coming next. I mean, this is just it's just pleasant for white, to my huge surprise. I've never really seen this plan in action before. Maybe it has the consequence that after rook a c1, we should maybe limit ourselves to playing something like a6, but the computer even still seems to indicate white is pleasantly better here. So, I mean, it started becoming extremely weird, right? We have a bishop that went to to d2 to f4 back to c1, and now after f5, I want to convince you that we should take and put it back on d2. But I mean, one should understand that we only do it after the move f5 has been played, and f5 is such a structure changer, right? I mean, it creates this weakness that basically it can be good for black, it can be bad for black, but we have to look things completely anew when this has happened. This is it's not a minor thing. It's not like playing, let's say, something like a6. We will think, okay, it doesn't matter. No, f5 we have to grasp that. Okay, this really a lot of things has changed, and apparently one could try this idea: takes bishop d2. I'm generally very impressed and have never seen it before. I would be curious to see it tested, but it strikes me as an interesting plan, perhaps only in this very specific situation. Harika plays much more logically and typically. She plays the move b3, Adams goes rook c8, Harika, like me, plays the move e3. It looks normal. It's sort of, again, we don't have to worry about f4. We shouldn't worry about f4, but at least we don't have to do it, right? I think what Adams is both doing against me or against Harika is exploiting this, that he knows he's the higher rated player. He's very experienced and understand that we're going to be a little bit nervous and perhaps not play the most critical move. So he's planning to be playing us in the long run, and here he succeeds. So bishop to d6, bishop b2, knight f6. My hunch was that but black is doing quite well here already, but the computer still seems to like white, which is quite sort of surprising to me, and maybe also bad news for Stonewall's fans. That because if something like this that actually looks like a very decent Stonewall is better for white, it's not great for black. Anyway, knight e2 happens, queen to e7, and now it starts going downhill for Harika, I would argue. The computer suggests that knight e5 is still a very, very useful move. Maybe what sort of the book mentions here is over the top. Maybe black should just play some kind of passive waiting move here. But I guess it's annoying that this diagonal has been opened. It means that d5 is going to be more loose when, let's say, black would like to play for c5. Somehow the knight on f3 was a little bit in the way, and it was blocking the bishop. And I think the exchange on d7 is going to be quite useful for white. At first sight, it looks like takes here, and knight g4 is just great, because how are we going to defend this pawn? Again, never ever seen this motive before, but the book mentions why not play a4 here, and it's actually a brilliant idea. How should black react? At first I thought, can't you just go a5 and after bishop a3, c5? But then something is going to hang on d5. Probably it's better to do knight f4 first and then take next here, because the bishop is pinning like this. So this really doesn't work. But this means that after knight g4, a4, it's not so comfortable for black. I mean, let's say knight g takes like this, then you would go probably bishop a3. You can't play c5 because d5 will be hanging. And after something like this, a5, it turns out that white has huge strategical compensation, and it's a very difficult and unpleasant position for black. Again, very interesting for me, and it's a very advanced play, I would say. But knight e5 is a beautiful idea, in my opinion. And maybe Adams should have developed slightly differently, but it just looks like he has done everything so logically in a way. I mean, it's not like his position is disastrous, but knight e5 is a very nice motive, because it's clear it makes white play so much easier than in the game. Harika does things, I would say, more schematically and logically, but it ends out quite badly. Knight to f4, it's sort of, putting the knight in this direction, I would guess. And after rook fd8, rook ac1, knight e4, I think she has kind of run out of typical moves. There's nothing wrong with White's position, but one has to have an idea what to play. And I have to admit, my intuition does not suggest the correct move for White at all. The computer, again, is quite insistent. Knight e5 is a great move here, and I think, well, seeing the previous example, we are starting to understand that here, apparently exchanging a set of pieces, a set of knights, is favorable for White. I was about to say that is atypical because when you have more space, you don't want to exchange pieces. But this is actually, I mean, not true. That well, the whole point of the Stonewall is actually that Black doesn't have less space than White. He has structural weaknesses. So perhaps that's why, in order to exploit this kind of weaknesses, we have to stop Black from advancing comfortably with c5, and knight e5 seems to be the way of doing it. Again, I guess an exchange on d7 followed by knight d3 will leave White in more control. So it's logical to, let's say, play c5, but the computer gives this line, takes on d7, then takes on d5, and now, well, of course, you could take with a pawn like this, but after d takes c5, well, it's not possible to take with the pawn because there's too many attacking on d5, so it ends up, not too nicely. I think bishop takes f4 is the computer suggestion, but now a very nice idea, taking on e6 and taking back. Then first the move d5, and when the bishop takes it, we take back on f4. And now basically, well, this bishop is extremely strong. It's hitting towards g7. I understand it's not going to be mate immediately, or perhaps never, but this bishop is just very strong and unopposed, and this is a considerable advantage for White. Harika, she played knight d3. That would very much also be my first instinct, but it seems to doesn't do particularly good for the White position. Adams could even play c5 now, but plays the move bishop to b8, and now finally she plays knight fe5, and not particularly a bad move, but as we saw, it would have been more energetic before. Adams takes it with the knight, and she takes back with the knight. Again, also the move would have played, and apparently a considerable strategic mistake. Computer suggests d takes e5, and now the very typical way for Black to react here is to take on c4 and then play the move c5. There is the threat of playing knight to g5 next and starting to exchange off these bishops, which is going to leave the White king very uncomfortably. But after the move h4, White is actually doing pretty well. It seems that this knight on e4 is quite stuck. I mean, I noticed the computer often will go king h2 and even start threatening this one with f3. And, well, White is still better here. It means perhaps that, well, maybe Adam shouldn't take on c4 immediately, for instance. But again, perhaps Dronavelli doesn't seem to, shine too much in this game. But she's a very strong grandmaster. And, well, we saw also that in this kind of very generic Stonewall positions, the decisions are very, very difficult. She took with the knight. And now it becomes a well-known theme. Black breaks with c5, and this bishop on b7 starts becoming strong. She goes queen to e2. Perhaps now Adam should even have played like this, the same theme as we spoke of before, but now with the difference that the g5 square is available. And I think, well, this is quite an instructive moment that basically... Oh, sorry, so I didn't manage to hit it correctly. The bishop here will sort of swap with the bishop on g2, and there's going to be quite some weaknesses on White squares. And also, well, in the earlier examples, I mentioned that there was this strong unopposed bishop on b2. It's still unopposed, but it's just shooting into this pawn, right? So it's actually going to be a very weak pawn there. And again, a lot of similarities, but the details massively matters. It's a very, very complicated. Adams took on d4. Tornavali took back with the pawn, and now she should probably have taken with the bishop, but now takes on e5 and takes on c4. We get this typical thing again, that at some point black opened for this bishop, and there is, well, at times threat like knight g5 as mentioned, but here something, well, quite different. Let's say if you play rook takes c4, we're gonna swap rooks like this. And now the book mentions a very nice move here, just to play the move h6 first, creating the king has space to go there, and then we can start perhaps playing queen to c5 next. There's going to be weaknesses on f2, and even should black sort of, let's say after h6, if you play like this, sure, it's opposite colored bishops, but it doesn't matter much. It's black who is attacking, and this bishop is very relevantly attacking this king, while the bishop on b2 is just shooting into its own pawn. So this is close to a winning position for black, sorry. After dc4, Harika took back with the b pawn, and now queen to b4 happened, and there is a lot of unpleasant tactical tricks. Well, it's basically the c4 pawn is weak, the bishop on b2 is weak, and so is perhaps the rook on d8. So there will be threats like rook takes d1 followed by taking on c4, and quite often perhaps playing h6, so there's no back rank motive. Harika's position kind of started to collapse here. The game was bishop d4, rook d7, bishop e3, rook cd8, takes, queen e1. I think the game was like this, and I just want to show the last move here. Rook d1 was a blunder, and now queen takes a2 happened, and you can't take on a2 because of rook takes d1 mate, right? But well, she fought on. Of course, she didn't allow mate in one, but she lost the game anyway. A very difficult video to make. I'm sure it was even more difficult to understand, but I still think it's a interesting and nice way to finish off the Stonewall structure, because there was so many difficult things to grasp here. Well, for a start, this yo-yoing bishop back and forth, but for me, well, I thought take bishop d2, that this actually could be so strong, and this idea of putting a bishop on b4, giving white a structural edge, that was difficult, I would argue. Then we saw things with, let's say, knight e5, and you would sacrifice a pawn and get huge structural compensation. For me, even, well, knight e5 here, exchanging off knights, somehow this grasping the concept that it's black who has more space. So it's strange, but white can start exchanging a set of minor pieces, and that means his structural advantage starts becoming, let's say, more relevant, because he's not suffering from having too little space for his own pieces. So an exchange actually helps the attacker for a change, and I think many other things. But let me stop it here. This has been a very long game, but I still hope you enjoyed it, and also it feels murky, but I felt I learned so many new nuances in this kind of Stonewall structure. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed and learned something too. Thank you.